We have a lot of content to go through, but this content is very interesting. It's highly technical. We're extremely happy to be backed up here by many units which have agreed to support G4 unit, where Mathilde is working. And we're also very happy also to welcome Miss Erika Geredzen, the Director of Human Development, Migration, Governance and Peace. We're also welcoming Miss Gabriela Fezes, the head of Unit G4, Social Inclusion, Protection, Health and Demography. And you will also welcome at the end of this week, Mr. Philippe Latriche, a special advisor to the Director General. So we are going to have very interesting conversations together. You will see throughout this week that we have also planned a number of guest speakers to come in and intervene. And you will find that we'll have panel discussions with them. And we hope you'll make the most of them through the different media you have to ask questions, to come in directly, so we can have very interesting interactive sessions supporting you in integrating the reduction of inequalities throughout your work in delegations or here in DG INTPA and throughout different thematics and interventions. With this introduction, I would like to say a couple of words on who is going to speak today. So here with me today in INTPA, we have Mathilde Cornu from G4 unit. Mathilde is now working fully on the reduction of inequalities through unit G4. She was working here with us before as a stagiaire. She then went back to France to work with the French Development Bank, AFD, also tackling inequalities. She has experience in Sudan and Somalia, and background is into economics and political philosophy. So that's one of your key speakers today to present this event. Then we have also Teresa Cavero. She's also working with us. She's belonging to the network set up by Adelante Knowledge and Development, a consulting firm. But she's also working full-time right now on the Policy Forum on Development, and she's been authorized to help us out with this event on the reduction of inequalities because of a background working with the Inequality Research Facility from AFD, funded by the EU, and with Oxfam as a researcher on inequalities. So she'll be also presenting today, in addition to a number of speakers coming up on video. Very quickly, let me now move on to the start of this event and the introduction by Mathilde.
So again, welcome to this Inequality Week. And as you may read, so this seminar aims to enable you to upgrade your knowledge of inequality and the reduction and how specific policy areas will lead to inequality reduction. So this seminar will be the opportunity to better understand how climate, fiscal, nutrition, social protection will integrate and be related to inequality reduction. It will also be the great opportunity to discover and know more about the new inequality marker. I think you have heard about it now that it's officially endorsed. It's an internal tool and is part now of the SSH's model and action document. I'm very pleased to let the floor to Erika Geredzen, our new Director G, following by the intervention of Gabriela Fezes, Head of Unit for G4. Erika.
Merci beaucoup. Thanks a lot, Jérôme, Mathilde, for the introductory remarks, and many thanks to all of you for having connected to this session today, and for your interest in this Inequality Week that G4 unit is organizing together with the various units of DG INTPA who will intervene during the week. I'm really very happy to be here today with you this morning. It's my, in a way, first event as a new director for Director G. So opening it on an event on inequality is for me really symbolically really important. Inequalities around the world are a major hurdle to the peaceful development of societies. Fighting inequalities is among the core priorities of the Commission when it comes to the external action, and of course among the core priorities of our Commissioner. And the reason for that is that inequalities are hurting individuals, but are also hurting societies. And if we are striving towards a world without inequalities and reducing poverty, obviously looking at all the angles of the inequality agenda is really important. Inequalities are a multidimensional topic. They are multidimensional by nature. They are either economic, social, political. They are also inequalities in countries, but also inequalities between countries. And really what I really like about the program that you are having with you for this week is that it is really looking at all these multi-dimensional aspects of the inequality agenda. And it's really a core to have this as a proper understanding of what we are doing here with this agenda. So what has DG INTPA already done in order to support this inequality agenda and the priority that the Commissioner is putting to this for her own mandate? Indeed, Mathilde already mentioned it, and you will hear a lot about it during the week. It's the I marker. The I marker, the inequality marker, you will have a specific dedicated session for this, but it's really important that we do identify each and every time we have an action that is supporting the fight against inequalities. It's important that we clearly identify them, mark them, and that we can therefore showcase how important our action is in terms of reducing inequalities. And this is again multidimensional, it is multi-sectoral, and this is where the program of this week will clearly demonstrate this multi-sectoral aspect of or nature of the reducing inequalities from all angles and from all sectors. There is a potential for streamlining the inequality dimension of the actions, and this is what you will go through this week. Of course, coming myself from the unit in charge of macroeconomic and fiscal policies, I cannot but say a special words about the role of fiscal policies in the fight against inequalities, having tax policies well designed, having spending targets and budgets in countries which are highlighting and reducing inequalities through different public policies is an essential dimension of this work, and this translates then therefore into the education policies, into putting in place social protection systems, but also in relation to inequalities which are related to the climate crisis in several countries and crisis response more generally. In this, the youth dimension of the political mandate of Commissioner Urpilainen is also really important, and having the voice of the youth heard in the context of the fight against inequality is important, because this is really the future of our world and also the stability of our world, which is at stake when we talk about this these questions. So you're having again a beautiful program ahead of you, and I'm really happy to see and really would like to congratulate the colleagues who have put together this program and who have been able to drag all the colleagues to contribute to this program. This is really co-creation, the way we can see it at its best, and I think that it's really the occasion for yourselves to reflect on how, in your work, in the delegations, in your daily work, when you design an operation, when you talk to civil society actors, to government actors, to private sector actors, how you can translate this fight against inequality in the actions that you are designing and that you are implementing. It goes also obviously for the global gateway priorities and all the work that is being done there, because when we design infrastructure, when we design the environmental the overall ecosystem that goes around this infrastructure, the inequality dimension also needs to be taken into very strong account, and of course also not to make sure that through our actions we do not increase inequalities when there is a risk of doing so. So this is also a risk that we need to identify and that we need to mitigate if that it would be the case. So on this, many thanks again for being here, for connecting to this Inequality Week. Many thanks to the team in G4 for organizing and putting this together with the team of Adelante. Thanks a lot, Mathilde, Jérôme, for facilitating this. And I think I will now leave the floor also to Gabriela, who will say a few words of introduction. So happy Inequality Week to all.
A great many thanks, Erika.
Thank you so much, Erika. Gabriela, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Erika, really, as she just took her new position, and that she could join us here, and very glad to see so many of you with us today from EU delegations, from headquarters, both from the geographical and horizontal side. This is excellent, and wishing really all the best for this week, and also to have very productive discussions. Of course, the week will also help us better understand your needs, where we can support you, where we can have further exchanges. And also, if I may say, we also welcome any new ideas from your side. What more can we do also when it comes to the fight against inequalities? We have taken a number of actions to mainstream inequalities in our operations. Erika has mentioned the various, of course, what we need to do. And there are also, of course, all the action documents we are working on together. But of course, it's very clear that we need to do more in this area. There are also very high expectations out there from civil society, from the European Parliament, and many other actors that we also clearly show what we are doing when it comes to the fight against inequalities. And this is why we have been working on improving measurements. And Erika has mentioned also the eye marker. And really, it's a top priority for us that we roll out the eye marker this year, and we are able to report next year on the first results. That's very important, and we really count on all of you to make that happen. In addition, I wanted to also inform you that we have launched a global Team Europe approach on inequalities. It is a Team Europe approach, it's not an initiative, but our objective is to better align our action with EU member states when it comes to the fight against inequalities, and also to have as much as possible common measurements. We have presented, in fact, our work on inequalities to the CODEF Working Party earlier this year, and there was a lot of interest. And there were also some member states who are particularly interested in the eye marker, whether they can also apply it in their interventions. And they, in fact, asked us to have an expert level discussion on the eye marker and the other areas of work. So this basically shows the high interest this topic generates. The other important area, of course, what we are working on is the equality flagships. And from Kenya, South Africa, Latin America, Bangladesh, Paraguay, and I can list many others, where we are working very closely with you to make them a success. And the equality flagships cover various areas from digitalization, social protection, fiscal policy. And it is indeed the objective that we show a clear progress through these equality flagships as well, and we showcase our work. So I really don't want to speak too long today, but again, I think what is very important for us is also to hear your needs and where best we can support you. And we also have now the advisory service, which has been expanded. It also now covers inequalities. Its name is HISP, so Health, Inequalities, Social Protection. And when you need specific expertise, we can also draw on these experts who can assist us. So with that, thank you very much, and wishing you a very productive week.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. Thank you again, Erika, for this opening again. We are really pleased to welcome you in this Inequality Week, and we are certain that it will be a great success. And as you have said, so inequality is definitely one of the main priority of our commissioner. And without waiting, we would like to introduce a video of the commissioner that she has done during the annual conference of one of our projects, the Research Facility for Inequality, and during which she emphasizes how inequality is key in all our interventions.
No one chooses where they are born, and no one chooses who their parents are. But as policymakers, we can work to ensure that one's origin does not predestine one to a life of inequality. And this has been very, very clear principle to me. The COVID-19 pandemic and the impact on the health systems, societies and economies has been like an X-ray. Unfortunately, it has also exposed inequalities. It has hit the most vulnerable, making it harder to leave no one behind. So it is clear that we have to respond. And as a Commissioner for International Partnerships, I am putting the fight against inequalities at the heart of our international cooperation. So let me explain my vision for tackling inequalities in 3 points. Firstly, a fair economy and fiscal policy especially. Opportunities are balanced with obligations. If everyone pays their fair share of taxes, there are more opportunities for education, public healthcare, and social protection. The EU stands fully behind the Addis tax initiative to raise more domestic revenue and improve tax systems to address inequalities. We need institutions that really work for people. My second point is about investing in people and planet. Human development, especially quality education, is one of the most powerful equalizers in society. The pandemic has disrupted the education of hundreds of millions of children around the world. And there is a real risk that many of these young people, girls in particular, may never return to school. So this is why I have decided to increase spending on education in partner countries from 7% to at least 10%. Then third, and my final point. One of the greatest inequalities is the feeling that you don't belong anywhere. Sustainable development and equal opportunities depend on democracy, on strong institutions, social inclusion, and participation. And this is why fighting inequalities also means investing in functioning states and resilient societies. SDG number 10, the first global goal dedicated to reducing inequalities, really, it unites us. We have the vision, we have the policies, the partnerships, and the tools. So now it is up to us to make this change happen.
Very well. So we have now heard from our commissioner, Jutta Urpilainen, and she's basically calling us to action on reducing inequalities. Before we do so, and I hope that you also, all of you, see my screen correctly, we'd like to take you through a number of key concepts this morning with Mathilde, with Teresa and myself to ensure that we all speak the same language. We have all the same understanding of what we mean by inequalities and the inequalities that we seek to address through our development cooperation at INPA, as planted into our reference document that we'll see this afternoon. So let us start with inequalities as a political priority, as just been portrayed to us by our latest three speakers. And why do they matter, these inequalities? And obviously, we're not going to go in a great number of details as we would do in a training. This is a different type of events, but I think it's important that we remember where we came from. We came from the Washington Consensus that has been driving how ODA was managed up to the point we started to have a view on the Millennium Development Goals and a focus on poverty. With the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, a new focus has been placed on the reduction of inequalities as the necessary mean to achieve social, economic, and ecological transitions, addressing key planetary crises and addressing our goal to create inclusive growth throughout all of the partner countries with which we work. So reducing inequalities is a mean to ensure that growth benefits all people in a country and that we achieve also on poverty focus. Addressing inequalities is also a way to deal with the reduction of the tension that there is in addressing poverty and reducing the impact of our economic model in terms of resource extractions, waste associated with growth, and to mitigate climate change impact and biodiversity loss that we are also witnessing throughout the planet. Obviously, with addressing inequalities, we are seeking to achieve something very important, is to avoid the perpetuation of the current situation that many people live in. Poverty is perpetuated from one generation to the next. Addressing inequalities, especially addressing inequalities of outcomes, seeks to reduce these determinants, address those, and provide social mobility, economic efficiency, and a better distribution of the benefits of economic growth throughout the population, throughout the countries. That's a key set of elements for why inequalities matters. Let us keep on driving with this view. Inequalities, which are obviously unfair, can be addressed, and their addressing is instrumental. Why is that instrumental? Because inequalities are a threat to democracy, peace, and stability, as we have seen in a number of countries. Inequalities obviously hinder the intention we have in empowering women, excluded groups from growth, from the economy, from society, from participation. Obviously, as we mentioned already, inequality is a key obstacle for poverty reduction. We cannot address poverty if we don't address inequalities. It's affecting our social cohesions. And obviously, if we reduce inequality throughout what we do, throughout our sectors, our interventions, we will have a catalyst to reach our goals with the Sustainable Development Goals. Very important, and this is why it's in bold here on that slide. Up to now, we have no known trade-off between policies to reduce inequalities and economic efficiency. And that's a very important element that research and evidence brings to us. There cannot be argument to justify maintaining inequalities in the name of better economic outcomes. It doesn't work this way. It works on the other way around. Inequalities are reducing our economic efficiency. Let me introduce you to Teresa.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Jerome. So there are different perspectives on why inequality matters. which are worth knowing about, as you will hear and read the arguments about inequalities from all these perspectives. One is the moral perspective, the Kuznets perspective, the poverty perspective, the efficiency perspective, and the political economy perspective. So if we go to the moral perspective, that says that inequality is morally wrong. And I think all of us would agree on that. And as such, egalitarian principles are central in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and are also present in most of the constitutions in our countries. But there is also the Kuznets perspective, which says that inequality is part of the process of development and is unavoidable. You will probably have heard this in your economic discussions. Inequality is expected to increase in the first phase of development, in the so-called the inverted U curve. And with time, what this theory says is that the prospects of development and economic growth will trickle down into the economy and into the society and revert that increase in inequality. Well, the evidence shows that that is not the case. So we have a problem with the Kuznets perspective. The poverty perspective states that inequality should be reduced in order to accelerate poverty reduction. This is what Jerome was referring to. It refers to the growth inequality poverty triangle, which says that lower inequality leads to a higher, what we call elasticity of poverty reduction with respect to growth, which means economic growth will lead to greater poverty reduction when inequality is lower. As an example, a 1% per capita GDP growth led to a 3% decline in poverty in Tunisia versus a 1% decline in poverty in Senegal, being much more unequal. If we go to the efficiency perspectives, state that redistribution and state intervention in general leads to inefficiency and hence to less growth. So this theory is saying that there is an efficiency equity trade-off. This is an argument that is commonly used by the neoliberal sectors and thinkers. And as Jerome mentioned earlier, there is no evidence that that is the case. So we should be cautious with this argument as well. And then finally, the political economy perspective, which is in my view the most important, even over the moral perspective, is that high inequality leads to capture of political power and opportunities by the elites, by those that are better off in our societies. And this leads to lower growth through market and government failure, and that has been proven. The IMF had a publication precisely on this, how more inequality means that economic growth is slowed down. It also hampers social cohesion and it threatens democracies. So we have a real problem in terms of our mandate in the poverty reduction and suffering mission related to inequality. Inequality threatens both political and social stability, since extreme inequalities create social tensions and can lead to increased crime and violence. It threatens the social capital as the ability of communities to share common values and coordinate actions at the local level for the greater good is diminished with inequality. And it threatens at the end the social contract in our societies, as the capacity of citizens to agree on those common values and set to get an agreement and set efficient policies at the national level. So this is the real issue that we have with inequalities. Inequality morally, one could overcome the moral argument, but to the point that inequalities are really slowing down the progress on policy making to benefit those that are most vulnerable and excluded in society, that is our main source of concern. Over to you, Jerome.
Thank you very much. Very, very fundamental element that you presented here, Teresa. Let us start our second sequence, what are inequalities? And we'd like to start this sequence with a little survey to all of you. So hopefully this will work seamlessly. If you go to the chat, you should find now a little link that you can click on that will take you directly to the HeartSpace platform. You should all be in. If you scroll down, you should find here our survey. What are inequalities in your own words? We'd like you to publish up to 3 words, and we'll have a quick discussion on that before we move on with some definitions, Mathilde and I. Please go ahead. We hope that you're able to get into this survey. That's all very interesting what's coming up. Thank you very much for
all your answers. We will now present them.
We see that you're still coming in, so just very well. So what are inequalities in your own words? Up to 3 words. What do we find out? Unfairness, injustice, this is clear, and I think that links up very much to the moral perspective that was just presented to us right now. And it's extremely interesting to see that. We'll see how that plays with the definitions we're using. Obviously, you're talking about opportunities and poverty. So this is where it leaves you. You're not able to move on with your capabilities. You're not able to use them as part of society. Disbalances in rights, discrimination. I think this is extremely important. That brings us to the moral perspective. That brings us to what hinders people to make their life better, to make their life fully. We also see avoidable, which I think is extremely important. Exclusion is avoidable, but obviously inequalities are avoidable if we work on them through our public policies to address their determinants and the drivers, and we'll look at that a little bit later today, this morning indeed. So I think we should thank you very much for this quick survey. That was extremely interesting coming up. Let's take that you have covered quite a number of aspects from the moral perspective, the economic perspective, the rights one. And I think the crisis and social crisis is also well addressed. Extremely interesting. Thank you so much. So moving on and going back to what are inequalities, we'd like to share with you a video by Anda David. She works at AFD. She was working at the Inequalities Research Facility. She's now heading still that department. She's based in South Africa, and she's telling us what she thinks are inequalities.
Inequality can be defined as the skewed distribution of opportunities or outcomes between individuals or groups. But this definition remains vague, and two questions actually can help us to further define inequality. The first one is inequality of what, as was phrased by Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen, and the second one would be inequality between whom. When discussing inequality of what, a first distinction would be that between inequality of opportunity, seen as differences in initial endowments, and inequalities in outcomes. These two are actually closely linked and reinforce one another. And inequality of opportunity, which actually refers to the individual characteristics at birth, like ethnicity or geography, can actually lead to inequalities of outcomes, such as the inequalities in earnings. I think another important concept worth mentioning here is that of equal rights, and especially that equality of rights does not automatically mean equal opportunities. Furthermore, we can distinguish between economic inequalities, and these are actually inequalities in outcomes such as income, consumption, or wealth, which are concepts measured using aggregates that are comparable and measurable across countries, across groups, and over time. These economic inequalities can be seen in contrast with what we could call social inequalities, which are mostly differences in social outcomes, such as education, employment, or social status. Another important distinction is that between relative and absolute inequality, with absolute inequality being actually absolute difference between outcomes or between incomes or between certain situations, whereas relative inequality is the relative difference between an income and another person's income, another person's situation. If we move now to inequality between whom, we can distinguish between inequality between countries, inequalities between individuals across the globe, and this is where, for instance, we can talk about global inequalities, or again, inequalities between individuals in a given country, within country inequality. And these last two concepts actually can be grouped under what we call vertical inequality, which practically means inequality mostly of income between individuals. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have horizontal inequalities, which are inequalities between groups which share common identities. And these inequalities, they can be in terms of religion, ethnicity, gender, and so on. They can also vary across countries and in time. Among horizontal inequalities, gender inequalities should be set apart as they exacerbate income inequalities through inequalities in access to education, to healthcare, to financial services, and ultimately reduce growth and undermine its inclusiveness.
So a very complete set of definitions presented by Enda to us. Don't worry, we are going to go through each of them with Mathilde just now, or at least a good number of them, so that we have this starting base together for going on throughout the week. So in defining inequalities, the first elements that we have to see here in what are inequalities, that inequality is a relational concept. That is extremely important. It's about differences between individuals, between groups throughout the globe, between countries, or throughout within a country. This element is probably extremely important because it sets inequalities and the work on inequalities apart from working on poverty reduction, which is defined in terms of lines and thresholds. So that's extremely important. These little pictures we have chosen tend to illustrate that relational concept of being part of a group, being separated in terms of rights, in terms of incomes, or in terms of your access to different opportunities in different type of part of the world or cities. And there are obviously different ways of conceptualizing these differences. And this is what we're going to look at in a quick element. So inequalities, differences between individuals, between groups. We've mentioned economic or social inequalities. We're coming back to this definition in a minute with Mathilde. Vertical or horizontal inequalities. Again, extremely speaking, we're coming back with a short presentation on that. And finally, outcomes vs opportunities. Again, often discussed throughout different papers or different debates you may have seen. And this is important because it has an impact on what we choose to address. So let us look at the first element, the difference between economic and social inequalities. Mathilde?
Thank you, Jerome. So as Anda has said, and as Jerome has said, so inequality is a relational concept and a relative concept. And you can explain inequality through very different distinctions. And the first one is economic and social inequality. Economic inequality is commonly described in terms of the differences between individuals or group position within the economic distribution. And what is the economic distribution? You can define it in terms of income, consumption, or wealth. And then on the other hand, you have also social inequality. And social inequality relate to the unequal distribution of public and social goods, such as, for example, access and achievement in education, health and nutrition, housing, employment, security, power, and rights. And both, of course, should be addressed simultaneously.
Moving on, shall I do it? The difference between vertical and horizontal inequalities, slightly more perhaps self-speaking. So vertical inequality refers to the inequality in the distribution of a variable across the whole population. Obviously, here we have mentioned a number of times income inequalities. It can be wealth inequalities. Obviously, this is a key element that we seek to address because it drives what you can do in life. It would drive also your achievements in education, your outcomes in terms of health, and so on. Horizontal inequalities refer to the inequality in the distribution of a variable between groups. It could be between men and women. It could be between different ethnic groups in the same society. So this is why we refer them as horizontal, because we're not classifying them in terms of their income or wealth or rights at that stage. So there's a between group and between individuals. That's extremely important, and we'll see how these definitions help us make sense of the measurements we're going to look at and how these measurements can help us understand the situation of inequalities in a given country or in a given context.
So we have inequality, we have economic, social inequality, inequalities, vertical, horizontal inequalities, and we have also inequalities of outcomes and inequalities of opportunities. So inequality of outcomes is pretty straightforward. It relates to differences in outcomes, such as, for example, differences in income or differences in educational achievements. And in addition of that, you also heard about inequality of opportunity, which refers to differences in economic or social outcomes that are determined by circumstances beyond an individual control or responsibility. And such as, you can think about age, gender, disability, ethnicity, origins, for also place of birth or family background. And the two are pretty related, inequality of outcome and inequality of opportunities. Unequal opportunities lead to unequal outcomes, and unequal outcomes today contribute to unequal opportunities for the next generation.
Thank you very much, Mathilde. These are extremely important elements, as you can see, because this will drive how we can respond to these inequalities. Within and between, inequality can be decomposed into inequality within a group, and that's what we can analyze within the group of women in a country, for example, or inequalities between groups, women and men, different regions in the country, different regions in the country, that will be, you will be able to distinguish also between countries simply. So not all inequality are decomposable. But usually we have measurements that give us extremely good pictures of the situation. Obviously, when you move into the cultural aspect, historical aspects, sometimes it's going to be difficult to understand all parts of inequalities. We would like to close this little intro to these inequalities in terms of definitions that you will find back into the reference document that was published 2 years ago by INTPA in much more details. We'd like to close it with short exercise that you can all do online again. So if we switch back to our link, we'll ask you to match statements to correct boxes. So it's a little exercise in our inequality house space. If you go back to it using the link and scroll down, you will find titles: inequality of opportunities, inequality of outcomes, horizontal inequality, vertical inequality, economic inequality, and social inequality. And we're asking you to choose which of the statements are actually the correct ones.
And again, you can find the link to our space in the chat box. And if you have any issues, please do not hesitate to contact the MCAI support.
We hope that you're all going through. Oops. Something I'm not.
Jerome, just a short message from the back. You can click on the 3 dots and click on show results. Then you can also present it to everyone.
Very good.
Each of the polls. Exactly.
But I think people are responding. I see a number of polls taken already. So maybe we'll leave it a few more minutes. Let's check our timetable. Yes. Please keep on responding. This is extremely useful for us and obviously for you, I hope.
For the first question, we have almost already 30 answers. Thank you so much.
So we'll keep going a little bit more, maybe 1 more minute, and then we'll look at each of them in sequence.
It's very useful because it also shows the difficulty to define inequalities, and even can see that people are having different answers. We will reveal in few seconds, but very interesting to see that indeed inequality is complex and difficult to define.
Very well. So I think we have at least half of the participants, if not more, have responded. So let us look at the first statement: inequality of opportunities. Obviously here most of you got it right. And we are working on the basis, I should have mentioned initially, but you've seen the mention of a training developed by our colleagues at SocioPlus, and we thank them very much for that. You see that these were evolving ways of presenting inequalities and training us and colleagues on this important topic. So inequality of opportunities, the statement that we are linking to it is individual circumstances at birth, like ethnicity, gender, or geography, because those elements will be the ones that determine your future opportunities. This is why we have linked that inequality of opportunities to this statement. It doesn't mean that we don't understand your points in saying differences between living conditions, but we'll come back to that and see how the statements better relate over titles or key definitions we want to address. So let's reveal inequality of outcome. What do we have here? I think some of you are still responding. So inequality of outcome, here the statement that we associate to it is differences in social outcomes, such as employment, education, and social status. I think that speaks extremely clearly from what was presented to us by Mathilde and David. The difference between opportunities and outcomes. Opportunities are determined at birth by a number of elements, but here outcomes are affected not only by those determinants, but over factors of productions, public policies, and we can measure inequality of outcomes at a given point, at a given time, across a population. And we measure those in terms of employment, education, and social status. We can measure it, obviously, in terms of income as well. Let us look at horizontal inequality. What do we have here? Again, I think that you got most of the answers correct, with 25 on the inequalities between groups sharing a common identity. This is what we've presented. So this is the idea of horizontality. Some groups have different identities, and we compare the different groups, men, women, ethnic groups, religious groups, or geographical distribution that enables us understand inequalities between these groups. As you can start to begin to see, these are different perspectives in understanding inequalities. It's not that one is better than the other, it's that they give us a different perspective to understand a specific context. And it's important to have that view because it enables us to better understand what's happening and why is this current situation in a given country or region.
In addition of that, just to complete, but as you say, so there are different perspectives in order to understand inequality. And what is very interesting in your answer is that there's different perspectives are not completely disconnected from each other. They are pretty related. So it's just a way to perceive inequality. But for example, horizontal inequality indeed are often associated with inequality of opportunities. And that's why also that the answer, the first answer, individual circumstances at birth, like ethnicity, geography, or gender, was also chosen in order to define horizontal inequalities. I think it's important to say that with inequality, it's always a complex subject that needs to be debated and discussed, and there is no one good answer at the end.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That's extremely useful to clarify those elements for the colleagues. And indeed, this is already revealed, so it seems that it's already working. Some little green tick marks that I'm not sure what's happening here. Sorry for that. Vertical inequalities. There it's a little bit more spread between the different statements. So I think highlighting or illustrating very clearly what you just said, Mathilde. It's not that easy to verify. Here, the statement that was referred to is the distribution often of income or wealth between individuals. So making a difference between the horizontal aspects, the vertical aspects is often between individuals, okay, on a specific axis using a specific variable that is often income, wealth between individuals. Could be access to credit as well, for example. So that's the vertical inequality. How do we move from here to economic inequality? I think that seemed to have been a bit clearer for everyone. This is income, wealth, and consumption inequality. Here we see it's a bit wider than just income. It's also going to consumption, and that's linking us to the economic definition, because with more inequality, obviously there is wider share in groups without possibility to consume, without possibility to power their lives with their with addressing their needs, and that reduces the ability of for opportunities to fare well in life, to use their capabilities, as mentioned by Teresa with Amartya Sen, but also reduce our economic efficiency. And then we are moving up to the social inequality, differences in social outcomes such as employment, education, and social status. That also links to empowerment. That also links to the inequalities between groups. If you're a woman, you have less social status in some countries than men. And this is our social inequality statement. Thank you very much for taking part to this survey. I hope this has been extremely useful for you to have a better appreciation of what the definitions of inequalities can be and what the different perspectives that can be used for us to have a clear understanding of a given situation. Just to recap on what we have just seen, we have here presented a simple set of definitions that you can read and refer to. Obviously, this material will be shared with you at the end of this day. It will be published on the platform. You'll be able to go back to it. This is completely in line with the reference document. So I am not going to read each of them. We've just seen those, but I think that's important that you're able to use this information and keep going back to it as we do, because even though we're already working on inequalities, this is some set of concepts and definitions that we keep on checking when we are facing a specific situation. So thanks for taking part to this survey. And if you have questions, please keep them hot or close to you, because at the end of this session, we'll have time to address your questions on any of those. Inequalities or intersectional. What do we mean by that? The concept of intersectionality tends to or intends to describe the ways in which some different aspects of inequalities like gender, race, income, disability, or class can interact with each other, like basically a matrix view. And obviously, this is making it even more complex than we have shown up to now. And this also justifies this learning event, bringing together the different thematics from different units, because that can help us address intersectionality. So for instance, urban ghetto will lead to poor access to what? Good education, because you're in a ghetto. Usually this is not where you have the best education, whether you live in South Africa, whether you live in France, or to good medical care. You may be in a white area, like in some places of Spain, or it could be Ghana, to transport and mobility, obviously, or to drinkable and affordable water, affecting obviously your health and your economic opportunities. And that's just taking the angle of urban ghetto. So these inequalities of opportunities will unravel into inequalities of outcomes. A person with disabilities, a woman, or an immigrant living in an urban ghetto will therefore face additional inequalities of access and opportunities compared to another person, perhaps not with disabilities, perhaps a white man not living in a ghetto, and that would be leading to higher inequalities of outcomes for her and obviously for her children in the future. So all forms of inequality are mutually reinforcing, and we have just here presented this set of definitions in this intersectional view to illustrate the complexity of inequalities and the importance of addressing them with the understanding we can derive from these different definitions. We'll look at measurement in a few minutes, and from their intersectionality. Oops. Yes. An important point, and again, a video from Anda David. She's a close friend to us, as you can see. Differences between inequalities and poverty reduction. Obviously, at this point in time, we felt you would be asking yourself these questions. So let us see what she has to say to us about that.
The focus on inequality should not be seen as an opposition to the focus on poverty. While the two concepts are different, with poverty actually looking more at the bottom of the distribution and inequality having more of a focus on the shape of the distribution itself, the two concepts have a lot of similarities. Inequality can actually be seen as relative poverty, and they are both multidimensional. However, there are also intrinsic differences that make the reduction of inequality much more difficult than the reduction of poverty. First of all, inequality lacks the sort of normative approach like poverty has. A person can be poor, but she cannot be unequal. Poverty is measured at the individual level, while inequality is measured between individuals. Inequality is a relative concept with changing boundaries, and there's no universal norm to it. We can aim to eradicate extreme poverty, although even that can seem unattainable to some of us. But we cannot, or maybe should not, aim to reach perfect income equality. Secondly, inequality is a phenomenon with extremely high inertia. This is partly due to the fact that intergenerational transmission of status is very strong. Therefore, the transmission of assets and distribution of assets is quite persistent. But this is also due to the fact that factors that determine inequality, such as policies that are linked to social norms, to institutions, and also the political regimes, do not change easily. Furthermore, we could reflect on actually the link between inequality and poverty. If we reduce poverty, does this automatically translate into a reduction of inequality? Or if we simply reduce inequality, would that translate into a lower poverty rate? These questions are quite complex. We could have very different situations. In the case of a crisis or a war, we could face destruction of wealth and therefore have a more equal distribution of wealth, but this also can come with higher poverty rates. On the other hand, we could use the poverty reduction to reduce inequality. This is the basis of the SDG 10.1, which is part of the SDG on reducing inequality. If we want to achieve a reduction in inequality, the incomes of the bottom 40% of the population need to grow more than the average incomes of the population. So by reducing poverty, we reach the goal of reducing inequality. However, the two concepts are interlinked through growth. We see that in a context of rising inequality and the lower pace in poverty reduction, we need to rethink the models of growth.
Thank you. And Teresa, would you like to take over to follow on from Enda's presentation?
Yes, sure. Thanks a lot, Jerome. So following up on what Anda has just presented, what are the differences between addressing inequality and addressing poverty? So as Anda just said, inequality is a relational concept, and it requires comparing the conditions between individuals or between groups of individuals, for example, by level of income or wealth, or by geographical location, or sex, or ethnicity, or religious groups. And addressing inequalities is going to be different than addressing poverty. On inequalities, one needs to observe and intervene on the two groups that you are comparing. So it's important because business as usual may do part of the work, but won't do what we want to do when tackling inequalities. So the first thing we need to do is to acknowledge that inequalities exist and are a burden to the progress and the development of societies. And second, we need to ensure that all interventions are designed to either reduce inequality or at least do not harm by preventing high or increased levels of inequalities. And doing this is challenging. This is the part that I do prefer in this presentation and this session, because it's the two arguments that I really try to convey to the people attending. So I hope I will make clear myself. On the one hand, addressing inequalities is more contentious than poverty reduction, because we are going to compare the situation of individuals, or more often groups of individuals. This comparison is going to show that one group is worse off than another group, and vice versa. So there are groups that are privileged and better off than other groups. And this poses a social and political sensibility challenge, because what we are talking about is about power and exclusion in the societies and the context where we work. So tackling inequalities often means confronting historical, cultural, and traditional norms that are deeply rooted at the country level in the context where we work. It also involves dealing with the existing power elites, which are often interlinked with the government structures. I referred earlier to the political capture effect of the accumulation of income and wealth. So, as I said before, beyond the moral argument, one could live with some people having a lot of wealth and income, but to the extent that this accumulation of wealth and income determine the orientation of the policy making, that is a problem for fighting poverty. So that is why when tackling inequalities, we need to be looking at these imbalances and at the different groups that we are comparing. And again, this is extremely politically sensitive. So for the European Commission and other donors, it's something to bear in mind, because normally interlocutors may happen to be on the side of the elites. So finding the right spaces to talk and discuss these realities openly and to make policy decisions regarding inequalities can be very difficult. So that is the one argument that you need to bear in mind when you're going to tick the E marker in your action document. Then addressing inequalities also require more efforts and resources. And this is also very challenging. On the one hand, you have the data challenge. So quantifying and qualifying the evidences on inequalities requires individual disaggregated data. It can be by location, by sex, by income level, ethnicity, and other relevant factors that we've heard about in the different definitions of inequalities in the exercise that we just went through. So we need data on the economic and social conditions that allows to compare the situation of the different groups of people that we want to target. And this data is often not available, not even at the OECD level of countries. So in many of the countries where we and you are working, that is a big challenge. Often national statistical capacities are very weak, and often we find data from only international institutions. So there is a huge issue of data gap that we need to deal with when we address inequalities, and it's worth knowing how important this is. And also it poses a cost challenge, because gathering new data is a costly and lengthy process. Sometimes it's just not possible to do it. And then analyzing the data also requires a specific knowledge and skills. So it's not going to be easy. The technical aspect of putting the picture of the analysis of inequalities in our context is very costly. Even if you had the data and you know who the most vulnerable and excluded communities are and where they are, reaching out to them physically can be very costly, because very often in many of the countries, you probably all have a situation in mind, these communities are in the most remote areas. So the level of effort in terms of time and resources that we need to invest to reach out to these communities is much higher than what we would do if we don't make that specific effort to target these communities. But if we don't do it, we may not be tackling inequalities. So this is what I always try to convene. So on the one hand, being very aware of the socio-political sensitivity of the issue, and being aware of the need to quantify and qualify inequalities, put the inequalities picture on the table, and being aware of the extra cost in terms of resources, economic resources to start with, that is going to mean tackling inequalities. So therefore, to identify and reach the groups, to describe the situation and comparing the groups, to measure the differences ex ante and ex post our intervention in terms of monitoring and evaluation, and to sustain that open dialogue with all the stakeholders requires more effort and resources than the usual poverty reduction interventions, and it is social and politically extremely sensitive. So good luck with the mission.
Oh, thank you very much for that. It's so important to say so, and indeed it is come at a moment where we have seen all of the definitions, angles, perspectives. Sorry. Obviously, this is also what is reflected into our reference document in the volume 3 of it, where and in its synthesis as well, how you're being called to action and to integrate inequalities in when you design your intervention. So we're aware of this challenge, and this is why this challenge needs to be tackled right now, head-on, by bringing in more information to the surface, by focusing on dialogue, by focusing on research.
And we will discuss that during afternoon session.
Exactly.
So stay online because we have some of the answers.
Thank you for reminding me that. I was going to forget. So, Teresa, we are going to our third sequence on how our inequality is measured. So this is rightly so because of what you just introduced. So please.
Yes, thank you, Jerome. So this is going to be very light. We don't want to bore you with a lot of technical concepts here. So just to mention that although there are multiple dimensions of inequalities, as we have been looking at, the Commission and INPA in the reference document and the e-marker decided to focus on income inequalities. This is important because on the one hand, it somehow simplifies the exercise, but also because normally income levels go hand in hand with individuals and groups' positions in the other dimensions. So we are not leaving aside all the other dimensions by focusing on income inequalities. So the most commonly measurement of income inequality that we all use and you're familiar with is the Gini coefficient. So the Gini coefficient ranges from 0 to 1. Sometimes it's given as 0 to 100%, so it's given as a percentage, where 0 indicates the perfect equality, where the wealth or the income is distributed equally among all the individuals in the society. And 1 indicates the maximum inequality, where one individual has everything. Reality is something in between. So what we do is based on this is called the Lorenz curve, what you see here. This plots the proportion of total income in the y-axis that is accumulatively earned by the X% of the population with lower income. So in the graph, just for you to be clear, in green, we see that 25% of total income is earned by the bottom 50%. And in red, we see that 50% of total income is earned by the bottom 75%. So once you obtain the curve with that distribution, the Gini coefficient is the ratio between the area that is in the previous slide, sorry, that is marked as S here in blue, divided by the area of the triangle ABC. you don't need to know that because you're just going to look at the number that is given at the end. Now, in the next slide, the Gini coefficient has two important drawbacks, which are a problem. One is that it's not sensitive to what happens to the tails of the distribution of income. We say that it is tail insensitive. So we are missing precisely what is in addressing inequalities, what we are intended to look at, which is what happens to the very bottom of the distribution and to the very high top level of the distribution. So in this example, you have two equal distributions in terms of Gini, the blue and the red, that are telling us two totally different stories. So in country A, in blue, 50% of the poorest population earn 10% of the national income, while in country B, 10% of the richest earn 50% of the national income. So because the two are symmetrical, they have the same Gini. So if we look at the Gini, we won't see what is actually happening here, which is that the share of the richest 10% is very different. In country A is 18%, and in country B is 50%. So it's more distributed in country B. So we are losing that capacity to differentiate among the different groups in the distribution. And that's why we say that it's not decompensable. Next. Okay, here Anda referred to this already in her presentation, just to mention that sometimes we refer to relative inequality when it relates to proportional differences in incomes, and we use very often the ratio, so the income of the, let's say, the bottom 40% compared to the income of the top 10%, for example. That is a relative measurement of inequality. And sometimes we will look at absolute measurement of inequality when we look at the difference. What is the difference in income inequality between this group of individuals and this group of individuals, or individuals per se? Other common inequality indicators, we are not going to go into the detail of this because I understand also that on Friday, when you look at the e-marker, you will also review a bit of the indicators. But very often we use, for example, the interdecile ratio, which is what I was saying now. The ratio is the ratio, the proportion between what happens to the 90% the poorest 90% of the population compared to the 10%, the richest 10% of the population. Or we look at the income distribution of the 10% compared to the bottom 10%. You can choose the group of people that you want. Also, Oxfam International has been publishing and campaigning about the share of the world income or wealth income, and by the top percentile of the population. So that is another way to look at it globally, not per country. You can also look at the share of income held by the top bottom 40%. And this is very closely related to the concept of pro-poor growth, and is one of the targets of the approach for INTPA, for the European Commission. Also, we look at the ratios related to the interdecile ratios, and the one indicator that we often use is this Palma ratio, which compares the share of the richest 10% of the population compared to the share of income in the country of the poorest 40%. And this gives better information about what is happening at these tails, the two extremes of the distribution. So we look at the top 10 compared to the bottom 40%. Just to mention that the end of volume 1 in the reference document, there is also more detail on the indicators and also on their sources. So you can check that if you are more curious about this. So back to Jerome.
Thank you very much, Teresa. This is extremely interesting and useful. and shows why the different perspective can translate different ways of measuring inequalities and what they tell us or what they don't tell us, as you just mentioned. It's very important to be clear about that. We'll now move to a new sequence of information on what drives inequalities. And obviously, here we'd like to introduce a conceptual framework for analyzing income inequality. You don't have to be learning this by heart, because you have it into your different documents, and you'll have it, you go back to it a number of times as you learn about inequalities, as you prepare for dialogue, or as you actually design interventions. What's important here is to focus on how socio-economic drivers and how policies may impact on the different factors that drive the income of a specific individual. Obviously, here we're right into INTPA reference document with the focus on income inequality. So this is why we are talking about factor distribution, factor earnings, and how these are affected by these drivers and policies. And obviously, this takes the view that we can change those drivers. We can change those drivers' impact through our public policies. So it's about how do we intervene as a state, and how do we support other states to intervene in changing this situation. And in this framework, and we'll come back to it on the day 5 with the inequality marker and the commitment to equality in the CEQ tools that will be presented by Christian Morabito. We'll come back to these 3 type of incomes. So the primary income distribution, this is basically what you earn through your work, through your labor or other means you have. And this, the primary income, is before being affected by fiscal redistributions, therefore before taxes and before social transfers. So this is where your Gini is usually measured, and sometimes Gini is measured after that as well. So very important to know when it is measured, because it has a different view. Then there's a secondary income distribution that will come from that redistribution through taxes and through social transfers. Okay, and that's a different measurement that tells you what disposable income is available to your household. And then through public spending, there's this tertiary income distribution that takes into account what you gain or not from such policies that obviously offer services such as health, education, can be transport, that are available to you as an individual or as an household, or maybe as a group, depending where you are based. So this is the framework we're using, and you'll be using probably through a number of your contexts to analyze the situation in your countries. Again, we have a short survey for you, so I will move to our link, and I'll ask you to answer that question. What are, according to you, the main drivers, determinant of income inequality? Please choose 2 or 3 words to describe them, and we'll have a short discussion on that with a short presentation about those drivers and determinants before we move on to which policies can affect them. So I hope you have been able to go to it and you're able to fill it up. Thank you.
Again, if you don't know where to look, so the link is in the chat. Mm-hmm. Cool. And also, just to let you know that all your answers are anonymous.
Important.
Very important.
even though we're very happy for you to write us questions and take the floor later on in our Q&A session that's coming up in about 10 minutes. So, lots of views.
Very interesting ones.
NJ, for some reason, if I am not able to display the categories, if you're able to do so, that would be very helpful to
All
go
right.
through the word cloud.
I do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much to have this platform managed by MKS team. So useful. So thank you very much for all of your answers, and please keep posting them on. Okay. So we see that according to you, the main drivers and determinants are policies. Okay, we see that. Here we have elements coming out such as labor or labor market policies, corruption, interesting because this is coming out now, and we'll see this afternoon, the governance issues is fundamental. Education, the system where we are working in, capitalist system, your social status within that system, obviously, wealth distribution. Perhaps, Teresa, we should have a quick round on these keywords and introduce the next 2 slides in a short time, if we can, just to make a difference between determinants and drivers.
Yes, exactly. So thanks a lot. I think it's the exercise is very interesting, and I really like the visualization and how most of the responses point to very similar directions, which are all correct. So basically, just to, again, to try to conceptualize a little bit the concepts here and the ideas, normally we are going to refer to determinants when we are talking about the factor endowments. So what is given to you, as the commissioner said this morning, because you are born in a certain place from certain parents. And that is going to determine many of your opportunities for your own development in life. So in general terms, we refer to determinants as those aspects that are given and that we cannot change, or we cannot change at least in the short term. They will be, they could be affected in the long term. But in the short term, if you were talking about a country, you would be referring to the land, labor, capital, and resources of the country. If you are talking about individuals, you are referring to the physical and intellectual skills, but also the sex, race, status, economic status, which is given from the household where you are born. And these determinants are going to be affected potentially by the drivers, the socioeconomic dynamic of the context where you live, and the policies. So it's great to see policies in the center of your responses, because there is where we can actually intervene and make the big change. So these are the interventions that are designed and implemented potentially that can affect the reduction of inequalities. In terms of the socio-economic dynamics that affect the primary income distribution, so the income at the end of the day that people may receive, here we look at the economic drivers, and we see things related to globalization, mobile capital reallocations, pressure to reduce tax rates in the international arena. We see technology, productivity difference between different sectors. We look at the skill premium, as we see that different sectors have different requirements in terms of skills, and the mobility between sectors or within one sector. There are social drivers, referred to sometimes to social norms, which are, as I said earlier, tricky to modify and to affect. We have gender differences in terms of education gap, earning gap, labor force participation gap, etc. And we have demographic drivers related, for example, to fertility differential, the ratio of fertility rate in the different quintiles of the population in terms of income. So in words, the different fertility rate between the poorest households and the richest households, because of the opportunity cost of education, mainly of the children. And of course, migration, domestic and international migration, which is a driver that could potentially be very positive in terms of modifying the original determinants of inequalities, that we all know all the problems that we face with migration. So, Jerome, back to you.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Sorry, participants, some of you may have your microphone on unmute. Could you mute back? Thank you so much. And thank you very much, Teresa, for this taking us through this difference between determinants and drivers and what can they be, so that we can now move on to what reduces inequalities, at least what we know reduces inequalities. We had another video planned for you, but for the sake of saving a bit of time for our question and answer session, I just invite you to watch the video out when you have the material. There are different policy options, and we are presenting them now so that you know some of those. So which are the policies that are likely to affect inequalities at primary level, meaning primary income distribution, and how we can affect on that. Obviously, here we're giving examples. Those examples are for illustration. This is extremely contextual, and we need to understand the economic structure of the country as well as the inequality picture of a country to be able to have examples that may be more telling to your context, whether you're sitting in Indonesia, in France, in South Africa, or in Colombia, just to cite this example. So one is factor distribution. Land reform is obviously a factor distribution that would enable you to produce differently, and there are different types of indicators that can be used here. Examples are given to you. Why? Just to let you know that many of these thematics examples we're giving you already worked upon. The indicators that exist and are agreed that can help light and shed light onto your current situation in your partner country. Support to human capital development through education. Obviously, that's a factor distribution. There's ILO that is presented here, but we know about the work by the European Training Foundation on education and technical and vocational educational training that also have a huge impact on this. Then there's also the returns to these factors, and obviously those are affected by a market and labor legislation, trade policies of your country or the regions, sector policies, such as working on agriculture and value chain and increasing the value of what has been produced. So these are about the primary income before tax and social transfers. Policies that are likely to affect at secondary level, these are going to be a bit more obvious to all of you, because we're talking about fiscal, net fiscal impact and social transfers. Obviously, the size and the incidence of those tax exemptions, tax expenditures, social transfers, or your determinants, also quite important, complex, analytical work to be carried out before decisions are taken. And these can be taxes and transfers, as you're well aware about it. Remember, tax are important, exemptions, which are called tax expenditures, and social transfers are all important to analyze in order to appreciate this impact at the secondary level. And tertiary level, so the disposable income after you've benefited from those public expenditures. And again, the incidence of public expenditures will have to be analyzed, because it may seem obvious that because you have free education or free health, the incidence is positive everywhere for everybody. It might not be the case, so you need to analyze those aspects, as our colleagues probably in health sector know. It's a matter of supply and demand issues, but here it's important to understand this, and the size of spending of public services as a percentage of GDP, the share of private services, and the incidence. And here we're giving you also some World Inequality Database that is provided as an example. Now, we've gone through this morning of presentations. Again, you're being invited to a quick survey. That survey now doesn't take you to work on what we're presenting, but actually to tell us what was clear, what remains unclear as of this morning, and which questions you would like to raise. At that stage, obviously, we'd like to invite you either to raise your question through the chat, and again, the link is in the chat box. You've been using it so far, or you may actually take the floor, raise your hand, and let us know what you want to ask us. So you can ask Teresa, Mathilde, and myself. The three of us will do our best to respond to you.
And again, thank you so much for participating in this first session. After this Q&A, we'll have a 30-minute break so that you have the time to grab a coffee, to grab a sandwich, and then we will have our 2 last hours for today. If you have any questions, the floor is yours.
Do you see some hands in the chat? No, in the chat, you have the link.
Oh, you can see a question here.
Okay.
Perfect. So I can see a question regarding a policy dialogue. It's a very good one, and definitely we will answer it this afternoon because it is one of the main subjects we will talk about. So let's take maybe this question for afternoon, and maybe I hope we will give you some elements to answer that. But happy to answer it during afternoon session.
Well, I like the question too.
I agree.
So you can like the question as you wish.
I'm not in a sense that something that is unclear or maybe on which you will love having more information is inequality indicators. And indeed, we will have a full session on that on day 5, and it will be the opportunity to discuss inequality marker.
Okay. We have quite a lot of things coming in. So
maybe to come back to the difference between secondary and tertiary income inequality.
Okay. Okay, let's do that. So difference between secondary and tertiary income inequality. Let me go back to that slide just to make it simpler. Where are we? We are here. So we move from primary level inequalities, which are affected by factor distribution and returns to factor. This is your income, but let's say it could be your turnover, let's say, to simplify the conversation. The secondary level is what happens after taxes have been applied to this turnover, basically, or social transfers have been given to you. That would be your secondary level income. And the tertiary level is what happens when you take into account the public spending given or offered to you for services you would be able to access without right. You go into public education, public healthcare, and these are services you don't pay for. So that's called tertiary income. I hope that simple going back to these definitions, I've clarified that question.
And we also have the chance that unit E1 and unit G4 will have a session regarding taxation, fiscal policy tomorrow. And another session will be introduced by our social protection unit in G4. So I think there are also some content that we will review throughout the week.
Okay, so another question about conducting dialogues. Again, we'll address this afternoon if you're okay with that. This is part of the reference document published by INTPA. Why not introducing inequality as transversal objectives, such as gender equality? Here, the focus is on inequalities, and therefore all inequalities are being addressed by this view. We're not restricting to one type of inequality, and that was also the point made about the intersectionality. So obviously, gender has got to be taken into account, and there's already a marker for gender, actually. But here we're dealing with overall inequalities with a strong focus on income inequalities and the intersectionality with other type of inequalities that might be gender, migration, that can be geographic or disabilities.
And again, I see that there's a question regarding the marker and regarding this multidimensionality, and I would like to emphasize upon that. The marker is not only about income inequality. Indeed, it's about targeting the 40%, the poorest 40%, but not only. It also captures all different aspects of inequality. In order just to retake the definition that we have seen, it is really at the crossroad of vertical and horizontal inequalities.
How to adequately approach inequality analysis without an economic background? I think the idea here is that this is a learning event. There'll be reference document, guidance. We're not suggesting that all colleagues should become specialized in understanding and analyzing inequalities, but you should be able to use the analysis provided to you so that you can insert them in your design for your interventions. That's slightly different. So you can always use research. You can always use national statistics. You can always have expertise being provided to you to understand the current situation of inequalities and how these can inform, I see the next question, your intervention design. Perhaps you want to come in here on that as well?
Yeah, maybe just to complete and to say that inequality is a cross-cutting issue. So it happened in all the sector, and definitely you don't need to have a specific background and a dedicated background in order to understand inequalities, because inequalities is cross-sectoral. So you need a background indeed on inequality, and this training, I hope, will give you some knowledge on that. And of course, Unit G4, on which I'm working in, is here to support you at each step of the project cycle to help you mainstream inequality in your specific sector. So do not hesitate also to contact us, and you can continue this conversation for your specific project, policy, etc.
Thank you, Mathilde. Teresa, are there specific points that were unclear that you see here, or specifications you would like to address?
Maybe yes. One comment first on one of the concerns about the how to address inequalities without an economic background. As said, inequalities in the work that we do, we see them. Once you put your inequality lens on, you will find them in all the sectors. And in a way, the decision, as I understand, from INTPA to focus on economic inequalities, on income inequalities mainly, it's basically because it's the easiest way to put a number in the analysis of inequalities. And normally it's going to go hand in hand with other inequalities. However, I'm personally not convinced that that is the most important dimension of inequalities. Probably if we talk about voice and representation and human rights respect and participation, etc., these are the issues that for many of the communities that we are working with are really relevant. But in those cases, normally the excluded and the most vulnerable groups are also going to be the poorest. So that's why the income measure is somehow facilitating the analysis. The question about determinants and drivers, yes, to go again through it, determinants are sort of given by birth. So you cannot change them in the short run. So once you are born or an individual is born, you are given with these conditions. So we take them in the short term as a given. And drivers are the dynamics that push certain individuals and certain groups into a certain direction, which normally in our concern will be of exclusion or privilege. We can affect those drivers through policy making, and through affecting the drivers, at the end, we will change the determinants of the future individuals. So that's the sort of a time lag between the two. Okay. The inequality indicators, again, is just to know that we are using either the Gini as a general view of the range of the level of inequality in a country. No matter, we have them for all the countries, and it's good because data is a challenge, as I said. So at least having one indicator is good, but that misses what happens in the two extremes, as I said. So that's why we look at other comparisons. But again, yeah. No, just to say that that it requires indeed a little bit of knowledge. So normally you will, and there's a question also on where to look for allies in your analysis and the planning of your work. So probably you want to get close to either academics or organizations, either CSOs or donors that do some research on inequalities to provide the arguments and the data.
Thank you, Teresa. I will come back to that this afternoon. Indeed, these are important elements.
Yes, and on day 5, and also we will this afternoon just come back on the structure of the reference document, because I think it's really important for you to know where to find the information. And in the reference document, there is a part dedicated to indicators, and there is an annex where you can find all the indicators per sector that could also help you beyond the Gini, because the Gini is just we just represent one aspect of inequality. And as we have discussed, inequality is multidimensional. So indeed, you're right to say that income is not sufficient, is not, and we need to go beyond, and we are. And this reference document, even if targeting income inequality, also discuss other aspects. And the marker discuss all the multidimensional aspect of inequality. And I'm seeing maybe we can finish on this question, that after that you can have a break, maybe take some fresh air and come back at 1:30. So there's a question regarding targeting the bottom 40% and not the 10% of lowest income. We are trying to, is not, as Teresa has said, easy, because inequality is politically sensitive, and that our interlocutors in the government could be part of the 10%, so it's particularly difficult. But the mandate of the Commission, and you can find it in the guidelines of the I-marker that has been published in the publication office, explicitly mentioned that we will try through our policies not only to target the bottom 40, but also the 10% in order to have this inclusive approach.
Thank you, Mathilde. We're about to close, but there are so many questions. We'll do our best to keep on addressing them this afternoon and throughout this week and on day 5. I see here also, and I'd like to close on that, perhaps this inequality is macro, how to measure, address it when working in specific sectors. Well, there are different perspectives about inequalities between individuals, between groups, within a country. And obviously this may sound macro, but obviously, as we've mentioned earlier on this morning, this is intersectional. So you can address them through different policies, as mentioned by Teresa, and therefore through different sectors. So you can address inequality through agriculture, working on value chain, providing more value to the initial producers that are usually at the initial of the chain, but get the lowest returns. So your agricultural policy, your trade policy would affect that. Or you may work on inequalities, for example, between groups, through how you address mobility within city for specific groups which are in specially isolated part of the city, a ghetto, or for women because working late and coming back at night may be seen as impossible and dangerous. So indeed, there's truly a sector approach that can be driven. And this is exactly what the day 2, 3, and 4 of this week are dedicated to. Our colleagues from the thematic units will bring their view on how their thematics, their sectors can help drive a reduction of inequalities. So thanks for asking this point and making that an important element for this coming few sessions. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you very much, Teresa, Mathilde. Thanks for our initial speakers, Erika Gerhansen and Gabriela Fezus, for their introductory speech. And thanks to all of you for participating. See you at 1:30 Brussels time.